Hi everyone. In this video today we're going to talk about writing a DBQ essay for AP History exams. And this is going to apply to AP World, AP Euro, and APUSH, all of these principles, techniques, expectations, and so on. Now we're going to focus on a sample DBQ from AP World, but the same techniques and way of thinking apply to the AP History exams across the board. So the prompt that we're going to be using for the sample DBQ that we'll be relying on and referring to over the course of this video is below. Number one, evaluate the extent to which Buddhism was accepted in Chinese society in the period circa 500 CE to 900 CE. And you can download and view the sample DBQ, including all the documents, using the link in the video description below. So just click on that and have that ready to look at when we start examining the actual documents. So first we're going to talk about planning a DBQ. And there's a few steps to go through, and as long as you just kind of keep this in mind as you address the DBQ and as you look at the documents, then you'll be in a good position to score well and max out your ability to grab points from the rubric. So first of all, this applies to every question, not just the DBQ prompt. Read and understand the prompt. So that means think about a few aspects of what's going on in the prompt, and you can underline, circle, put stars next to, just make sure you're marking off in that prompt exactly what the important things are that give you a clue about what you should be looking for and thinking about. So first, what's the time period of the prompt? There's usually going to be a reference to some specific frame of time. In this case, it's 500 CE to 900 CE. Then, what are the historical concepts and events referenced in the prompt? What is this prompt about? So for this one, you've got Buddhism, you've got accepted in Chinese society. So that gives you a clue about what kind of outside knowledge and context you should be trying to think about as we move deeper into the documents. Then you need to think, what am I looking for evidence of as I read the documents? In this case, you're going to be thinking about evidence of the extent to which Buddhism was accepted in Chinese society. So chances are you will find documents showing you a great deal of acceptance, maybe some documents showing you very little acceptance, people rejecting Buddhism, maybe some documents that are kind of, in between those two extremes, and expect that you'll see a wide range of evidence over the course of the documents that you'll have to account for as you make your evaluation. Then finally, what is the task the prompt is asking me to complete? In this case, it's evaluate the extent to which Buddhism was accepted. So as part of your thesis and the overall sort of argument of your essay, you should be thinking, like, based on the evidence, what can I really clearly say about how much the Chinese people accepted Buddhism during that specific time period, 500 to 900. So once you've gotten the prompt out of the way, then ideally, before you even start looking at the documents, you should start thinking about some historical context and basically just brainstorm a few details of context that, is, if you do this right up front and you're able to come up with some specific details, it'll actually help prompt you to interpret the documents a little more clearly and thoroughly, because you'll sort of have in mind other things going on outside of the documents themselves that are going to help you interpret the documents. So when we say historical context, this means what are historical trends, events, or processes leading up to, during the time period, that may help us understand the concepts in the prompt, that are relevant to the concepts in the prompt. So this is something that you can think of over the course of the essay or over the course of the DBQ as you're reading the documents and trying to think about like what is going on specifically around them. But ideally, you should get this out of the way right up front. Now, if you blank a little bit on brainstorming context, don't sweat it, move on, and then as you're reading the documents, you may find that your memory gets triggered by something you read to bring in as context. So, another way to think about context is just kind of telling the story of how the things in the prompt came to be. So in this case, for Buddhism accepted in Chinese society in the period circa 500 to 900, you might want to think about things like, well, how did Buddhism get to China in the first place? Where did it come from? What trade routes did it cross in order to arrive in China? What types of people adopted Buddhism? Which types rejected it, as far as you know? Why? What were the basic teachings of Buddhism? Which versions of Buddhism emerged and might have influenced China more directly? What influence did Chinese Buddhism have elsewhere, on other parts of Asia? Anything just going on before and around that time period that is relevant to the discussion of Buddhism and its acceptance in Chinese society. Now, then you're going to want to read and analyze the documents. So as you do this, there's a couple things to keep in mind. One, look for evidence that will help you develop an argument in response to the prompt. So it's easy to fall into the trap of just thinking pro and con. This document is for or against. This document's author shows, a negative attitude or a positive attitude. Wipe that away. Think very specifically, what is this document showing me about the things that the prompt are talking about? So, in this case, what is this document showing me about how much the Chinese people accepted Buddhism? That is what you're looking for. It doesn't really matter what the author's personal attitude is. Just what can I say based on this document about the extent to which Buddhism was accepted in Chinese society? Then, also as you're reading the documents, think about BCAP and sourcing analysis. So in my class, we use BCAP as an acronym to break down the different sort of aspects of sourcing. So the author's background or point of view, so who is this author? What life experiences do they have or not have? What social class are they from? Nationality, religious background, place in society, gender, anything that affects the way this person might think about the world around them is important to keep in mind. Then think about the specific context, historical context of that document. What's going on right around the time that document was written? Then think about the audience for the document. Who's supposed to be seeing this or reading this or taking it in? And that's usually going to be related to purpose. What is the thing that this author is trying to accomplish? What are they trying to convince their audience of in this document? And then you need to think, how are one or more of these helpful in understanding and interpreting the document the author wrote or produced? So how does this help to sort of explain why the author wrote in a particular way, or shows us a particular attitude, or shows us certain evidence but not other evidence? Basically, how do one or more of these explain the motivation behind the document? Then, you should try to bring in at least one example of outside knowledge that adds depth to your argument by elaborating, supporting, corroborating, or contradicting evidence in the documents. Think, what else do I know about this topic that adds more detail to, is similar to, or is contradictory to the evidence in the documents? Just what is something not specifically mentioned in the documents I can bring in to help add more evidence to my arguments? So, now, once again, as you're reading and analyzing, look for change over time in the evidence in the documents, even if the prompt does not explicitly ask you to. The documents are arranged chronologically from earliest to most recent. So it's going to be showing you over time that you might see some trends emerging. So now you're not necessarily going to see change over time in every single DBQ, but it's important to just kind of be on the lookout for it, because if you can find it, if you can see it emerging and use that as a basis for a good argument, that's something that could potentially get you into the complexity point in the rubric. That just shows a lot of sophistication and ability to really sort of understand historical trends. Now, also then, as you're reading the documents, don't just think about them in isolation from each other. Don't think of them as individual documents. Think about how they kind of fit with each other, how a later document kind of fits with earlier documents you're seeing. And you should try to group the documents based on similarities in what the evidence in each document is showing you. Think about how the evidence in each document supports, corroborates, that's kind of a synonym of supports, elaborates, or contradicts the evidence in other documents. And think about the story the evidence in the documents is showing you in response to the prompt. So as far as these groups go though, they should form the basis for your arguments and your thesis. So, whatever evidence the documents are showing you, the arguments you make in your thesis should be based on some point you can make collectively about a group of the documents that are in the DBQ. The groups do not all need to be based on similar numbers of documents. So if you have one argument that is supported by 4 or 5 documents, and a counter argument that is supported by 2 documents or 3 documents, that's fine. The evidence is the evidence, and it's just up to you to interpret it correctly and then make valid arguments based on that. It is appropriate to generate an argument based on the evidence from a single document, as long as your interpretation of that document is valid. So if there's a document that you're kind of having trouble fitting with other documents to make a point, you can still make an argument based on that one, and that's fine. You don't have to group it with another document. The grouping is simply just a sort of cognitive tool to kind of focus in on making arguments rather than just talking about the documents separate in isolation from each other. And finally, it is appropriate to use evidence from a single document in support of multiple arguments. So if there's one document that's showing you evidence for a couple of different points you can make, a couple of different arguments, you can explain everything that document is showing you. And being that thorough is going to show a lot of sophistication and will really impress the graders. Now that we've talked about the planning steps for the DBQ, move along to video 2 in this series, where we're actually going to look at the documents for the sample DBQ and discuss kind of how they fit together and talk about context as well. See you there.